On episode 2000 of the Joe Rogan Experience, Duncan Trussell came on to celebrate the bi-millennial anniversary, but while Meow Meow and Nuff Nuff were getting everyone's attention,
we're furries!
Yeah, we've been holding it in forever.
Some other part of the podcast caught my eye. The two go down one of their esoteric brainwave conversations about drugs and karma and the CIA, and about 20 minutes in, they get to the topic of epigenetics, at which point Duncan says this.
Add to that the epigenetic component, and then the United States has been at war 93% of its history?
Yeah.
And then the next day, the Instagram page, the JRE Companion, which is great by the way, go and follow it, posted this to substantiate it. Quote, the United States has been at war 225 of the 245 years since 1776, spending 92% of the time since its independence involved in some sort of conflict. There is no source given for this statistic in the post, description, or comments, and obviously those numbers will go up slightly depending on which year you watch this. But that stat isn't too hard to find with a quick Google, and the main source for that stat is the Pakistani outlet The News, which claims it gets the stat from the Pakistani Zhang Media Group in January of 2020, but since then other sources have built on this work and done more digging. So all of this got me thinking, has the US really been at war that long? And of course, the other question of what does this mean for the characterization of American foreign policy? We're going to delve into that, but first remember to like, comment, subscribe, and hit the notification bell, and follow me on Instagram at History at its Finest, and thank you for watching. So first things first, we need to set a definition here. And this definition is very important because it totally changes the statistics that we're looking at today. That definition, of course, is the definition of a war. As the JRE Companion post specifies, the US has allegedly been involved in some sort of conflict for 92% of its existence, but that is a very broad definition. So let's try to pin down a suitable definition for war. The most narrow definition, of course, is simply looking at all the times America has officially declared war on another country. As of 2023, America has declared war 12 times. The first technical declaration, the 13th, was actually on July 4th, 1776 against England, even though it wasn't a modern declaration by Congress and the war actually started over a year earlier. The first official declaration was in 1812 against Great Britain during the War of 1812, which lasted for 2 years. Then America declared war on Mexico in 1846, which lasted for another 2 years. The Spanish-American War of 1898 lasted only a few months, and then World War I hits, where the US declared war on Germany and Austria-Hungary in 1917, participating in that conflict for less than a year. World War II was the last time America declared war, with the US declaring against Japan, Germany, Italy, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Romania in December of 1941 until 1945. I'd also like to comment briefly on how we measure how long a conflict happened and what years to count to it. Like most things, wars don't start or end at exact intervals, and just tend to end where they end and start where they start. As a result, even if on paper a war is said to last a certain number of years, in reality that time period may be a bit shorter. Just as a quick example, America entered World War II in 1941. However, America was only in the war for 20, I guess it depends how you count it, but 23 or 22 days in 1941. So saying America was at war for 5 years here is inaccurate, because it's really less than 4 years. So to make the metrics a little more fair, I'm going to be adding up the number of days of a conflict and converting that into X years, Y months, and I'll be using the podcast's date of June 20th, 2023 as the cutoff point. Also, I'll not be starting on July 4th, 1776, but rather just the start of 1775, which is when the Revolutionary War started, since I don't think it's fair to exclude the first year of America's first war. Anyways, when we total it out, America has been at declared war for a total of 18 years and 9 months, out of the 248 years and 2 months of America's existence, This comes out to just 7.6% of American history, much smaller than that 92% figure. Almost half of this is from the Revolutionary War itself, which ran for 8 years and 4 months. That being said, America has been in many more direct conflicts without a declaration of war, which brings us to a different definition of involvement in a war. This definition, which in my opinion is the closest to what people think of when they think of war, is when American forces are engaged in a concerted effort in direct violent action against another armed force. Other qualifying factors may include actual boots on the ground, as well as involvement in a greater than a peacekeeping role, i.e. guys with weapons actively going out and killing other guys with weapons rather than just defending civilians in a crisis zone. If we use this definition, our numbers balloon massively. First, let's look at what we would consider the remainder of America's major wars, or the wars you probably learned about in school. These are the Civil War, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Persian Gulf War, and the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq as part of the larger global war on terror. These conflicts add up to another 38 years and 2 months, bringing the percentage to 22.9%, much higher than the declared war stat. But many more conflicts fit this definition of war that we've laid out, even if they don't get as much attention. The Global Research blog, link in the description, lays out a year-by-year rundown of American wars through 2015, and as you can see, there's a lot. I won't touch on every war as that would take way too long, but here's the main categories that the wars fit in. First and most pervasive are Indian wars, where the American government, often along with settler communities, fought against a myriad of native groups as settlers moved west. Wars of this type started well before the foundation of America and had mostly finished by the 1880s as most natives were forced onto reservations. These wars tended to be lower intensity and often overlapped or were nested into each other. For example, the 1850 Yuma War and the Pitt River Expedition were part of the wider California Indian Wars, despite being listed as separate. Nonetheless, Indian wars were more or less constant to some level or another until the 1880s, with the most intense period being during times of westward expansion, especially in the aftermath of the Civil War. Pirate wars were more common in the early days of the US, and these saw naval expeditions against, you guessed it, pirates, most notably against the Barbary pirates of Libya in the early 1800s, as well as Caribbean pirates. Perhaps my favorite style of conflict here is what is called range wars, which are pretty much the epitome of the Wild West. Here, two factions, usually either companies or families, would wage war with each other over resources or blood feuds, with lawmen and outlaws getting involved sometimes. Again, these are hardly really wars, but we'll still count them because it's semi-large scale groups of armed people attacking each other, even if the US military may not be involved. These popped up in the late 1800s, although this happened to some degree with the Mormon Wars earlier, which is a whole other fun story. Finally, we have colonial wars, which, like the Indian Wars, are the biggest blots on American history. It is probably fair to say that Indian Wars were actually a subset of colonial wars, but for this video we are using colonial more so to refer to US interventions in other countries. These wars tended to be small but definitively offensive in nature, and often served to forcibly expand American influence in the world, especially in East Asia and Central America. The most notable example here, which kind of kicked most of it off, was the Philippine War, which occurred when America liberated the Philippines from Spain in 1898. The Boxer Rebellion in China is another example, as are the takeovers of Hawaii and the Fiji Islands. Invasions of Central American countries were more common, with the infamous Banana Wars seeing the US take action against governments and rebel groups in Cuba, Nicaragua, and Panama, and others so as to ensure stable fruit trade for American companies. These lasted until the 1930s. When we move into the post-World War II era, we really have four-ish main types of wars. First is containment wars, which sought to keep communism at bay via military action. The most notable examples here are Korea and Vietnam, but smaller instances existed as well, such as Grenada. The global research list, however, also includes CIA wars, where the US and CIA gave military aid despite no US personnel actually killing anyone, for example in Nicaragua or Afghanistan, which is a category we'll get into later, but for this general definition of war, we're going to exclude. After that, we have peacekeeping wars, which often are done in concert with the UN or NATO in order to respond to a humanitarian crisis or overthrow of an allied democratic government. The most notable examples here are Somalia, Bosnia, Kosovo, the Philippines, and Haiti. Some of these wars fall into an America World Police category, however, where America decides to take action on its own, usually on less humanitarian reasoning. The standout here is Iraq in 2003, as well as places like Libya in 2011 and Panama in 1988. While justifications can absolutely be made here, it's worth noting that the American government acted more or less alone, even if other countries would join in as well, rather than at the behest of the international community. Finally, we have GWOT, Global War on Terror action, with the most notable example here being Afghanistan, as well as smaller scale actions in areas like Pakistan, Syria, Yemen, yada yada yada. You could throw Iraq in here as well, but the justification for Iraq had much less to do with terrorism than other operations, even if it's grouped into the GWOT as well. And of course, as time went on, Iraq kind of folded into the GWOT, even though the initial invasion was with Saddam Hussein, not for Al-Qaeda. Even in these conflicts, you can debate where to start or end them, as the long-term wars had progressive escalation and withdrawal, so it's not obvious when these conflicts meet the definition I just set out. For example, in Vietnam, I am actually using the 1964 Gulf of Tonkin incident as our start, even though some start the war in 1955 when American advisors were present. The GWOT is also complex, as it's hard to say what should count as direct action when American contractors and drones and spec ops will often take offensive action in countries with no conventional presence. For example, America has drone-striked people in Afghanistan after the withdrawal. Does that mean that America is still at war with Afghanistan? This is all much harder to tell, but since the GWOT is often considered to still be going on, with troop presences in Syria still going on, as well as to some degree in Yemen, even if it looks more like dozens of small operations in many different countries rather than something we saw in 2004 Fallujah. In our definition earlier, we had the term concerted effort, so again, many of these conflicts, or at least large lengths of these conflicts, whether it be on the frontier or in the Middle East, are debatable in terms of meeting that standard, but since that would just be too hard to look into every single war and see when they ebbed and flowed, we're just going to stick with hard start and end dates. Finally, we have the loosest definition of war, which is when the US merely advises or supports a faction at war. The Global Research List includes this as a war in their metrics, with the Ukraine Wars, Soviet-Afghan War, and the Yom Kippur War. In my personal opinion, this does not count as war. It's not neutrality or anything, mind you, but I think that this standard is just too broad. If there are no Americans fighting, then America is not at war. By the logic of global research, having an ally at war is just the same as being at war yourself, which is asinine, but that's just my opinion. When we factor in these wars as well, the total comes out to 93%. I'll note that this list only goes to 2015, and again, depending on what research you use, the number will be either 92 or 93. However, I have to reiterate that I think that this number is high because A, the data does not account for the fact that wars don't last full years. B, very low intensity or peaceful spans within a long-term war are not accounted for. I don't account for them either, but just something to keep in mind. C, indirect American involvement is considered to be at war when it is not. And D, there are various inaccuracies in the data, such as missing conflicts, extremely low intensity conflicts, and the inclusion of events that are not wars or not even in America. Let's address this last point real quick, and this will be focusing on the global research list again, since it is the only one where I was able to find any data. Most of these wars listed are totally legitimate inclusions, but some conflicts are missing. For example, Operation Gothic Serpent, when American forces took part to defend Mogadishu from starvation and warlords, is missing. More obviously, some things are included that aren't actually wars. Various events, including massacres and exploratory expeditions, are listed, such as Wounded Knee and the Yellowstone expedition. Many conflicts are extremely small scale, such as the Pennamite-Yankee Wars, where 3 people died over the course of 4 years. The Sheep-Eater Indian War is another example with only 1 death. I forget if I even counted this as a war in my final analysis. Some examples, like the Buckshot War, had 0 deaths or injuries, but is still listed as lasting 2 years, despite physical confrontation lasting less than a couple weeks. Some examples are even outside of the US, like the Cypress Hills Massacre, which was in Canada and did not involve US troops, but there were some US hunters. So what does this do to our percentage of time at war? Well, it changes. I went through the list one more time just to be sure to verify a few things, and along the way I found even more discrepancies. Some wars which didn't even exist were put in, some things that weren't wars were there, and sometimes wars would have the wrong dates. When it was all said and done, it's actually easier just to calculate the years at peace, and now we can compare that to the oft-cited stat. So Duncan Trussell and Joe Rogan, and the online OG sources claim that America has been at war for 225 of its 245 years, totaling 92 or 93% of its time, depending mostly on the year the stat is presented, which again, we're sticking to the day of the podcast airing in June 2023, meaning the US has been at peace for just 20 years. My findings, however, are quite different, and most of that time difference comes from 2 factors. 1, the other studies cite an entire year as being a war, which for years during wars is fine, but is an issue for when wars begin and end. Some wars are counted as being a war despite a literal single day of combat, which appears in 1845, 1981, 89, 93, and 96 at least. Totaling up that lost time comes out to 26 years and 8 months by itself, already more than the original stat. But the larger chunk comes from years where there was just no war. About half of these are acknowledged by the stat, but most are not, usually due to expanding the definition of war to include espionage and support of a foreign faction, but occasionally just from straight up ignorance and getting dates wrong or including semi-fictional wars. When all is said and done with more rigorous research, the peace number of 20 years goes up to 79 years and 8 months. That 92 or 93% stat goes down to 67.9%. Mind you, that's definitely still a majority stat, but still 68 is a lot different in people's minds than upwards of 90. That being said, I know the list was missing some conflicts, and I threw Gothic Serpent in there since I recognized it as missing, so it's possible that this stat is actually a little higher, but any conflicts missed are likely minor, and I would be surprised if any lasted more than a couple years. I also didn't include, again, those times of downtime within a given war where there was no conflict for a long period, like the end of Afghanistan, for example, which would probably balance that back down. Surprisingly, America's longest peace streak was from late 1953 to late 1963. This window is especially surprising given that most isolationist narratives portray American policy after World War II as exceptionally active and imperialistic, when in fact most of those ugly chapters occurred long before this, spanning roughly the century from the 18 to 1930s. To be sure, America had advisory troops in Vietnam during this time, and the CIA helped overthrow the Guatemalan government, so it wasn't totally isolationist or anything, but still, US personnel were not killing people at this time. America's longest war streak, by contrast, was from 1845 to 1888, a time dominated by the Civil War, Mexican-American War, and more pervasive wars with the formidable Plains tribes of the Sioux, Comanche, Navajo, and Apache. This window could even be expanded before 45 if we include Indian wars with the Republic of Texas and Mexico that happened in the same area as beforehand. That's all well and good, but what does this all mean? Well, first, don't believe everything you read on the internet. I was quite excited and somewhat shocked when I saw the global research list, and I figured it would be a slam dunk to research, but it turns out there was a lot wrong with it, and I could do a whole video just correcting this list with basic internet searches. But second, I think the main thing about this is how it characterized US foreign policy. In America, while things are certainly changing a little now, I think most people grew up thinking America was more or less sunshine and rainbows kind of place. I was talking with some friends recently who were immigrants, they're adults, and they even said that, they thought America was sort of like a paradise, and the more they learned about American history, the more they thought it was actually like a not very good place. And I would maintain that compared to the rest of the world, America still is sunshine and rainbows. That being said, I think if you're watching a history video, then you know that America has had horrific parts of its history, many of which are far more recent than we would like. And perhaps the most recent and most tangible stain on our nation's reputation has been Cold War and GWOT invasions and interventions that seemed internationally illegal and self-serving, often leading to the deaths of millions of people and destabilizing entire regions. That 90% figure we saw earlier plays this up even more. It strengthens an idea of a sort of American warlike nature, especially when similar analyses aren't done on other countries to compare, which I didn't do for this video, but if I had to guess, most countries would have similar or greater percentage of time at war, but that's another video. People will often skew data to agree with their viewpoint, and it's no surprise that this is a stat being advertised by a Pakistani source. I hope my statistical analysis has helped to soften the idea of a warlike America and make it more accurate. Obviously, it's still a high, but probably more reasonable and of course more realistic number. I also hope it shows how data can be misleading or poorly done. That being said, I don't totally disagree with the specific point Joe and Duncan were making when they brought this up. If you've forgotten at this point, I don't blame you. They were referring to how American war-making has fostered a multi-generational culture and perhaps epigenetic footprint of war and violence. Like most traits, this isn't... Think of, Lieutenant Dan in Forrest Gump. Like most traits, this isn't inherently bad provided it's channeled in a proper context, i.e. a just war, which I think they even allude to some degree as well. So in short, what did we learn about American wars? America has been at war most of its existence just under 68% of the time. While exceptions abound, most of the early wars take place on the American continent, mostly against natives, but also against neighboring countries and even against other Americans. Around the late 1800s, America conquers the last of the Indians and sets its sights on weaker countries and becomes an imperialist power in Central America and East Asia. This persists until the early 1900s, at which point the world wars happen and America becomes more international, mostly relinquishing its imperial pursuits in favor of combating communism, although sometimes those two spheres certainly overlap. This era actually has the longest period of peace in American history, ending with JFK and intensifying after his death. By the end of the Cold War, America starts to lighten up again, with very limited conflicts in the Middle East before 9/11, at which point America has been in conflict in the Middle East and Central Asia for over 20 years, although this has certainly throttled back significantly in the last couple years. And no, I would not say America is at war in Ukraine, even though we're giving lots of military aid, but we'll see what happens, I suppose. So, if you wanted to live in the most violent era of American history, be a cowboy or a frontiersman in the 1800s, and if you want to be in the most peaceful, be a silent generationer in their youth in the 1950s. So, that's it for this video, everyone. Hope you enjoyed. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe for more content, and hit the notification bell Follow me on Instagram at History at its Finest, and I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.